May 28, 1940. Reich Air Ministry, Berlin. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring dropped an intelligence brief onto the table with open disdain. The report described President Franklin Roosevelt's appeal to Congress for a massive, unprecedented surge in American aircraft output, an annual capacity of 50,000 planes. Göring scoffed in front of his staff. To him, it was theatre, an attempt to intimidate Germany with numbers. America, he insisted, had no understanding of real wartime manufacturing. Let them try to turn car plants into aircraft factories, he said. They would quickly discover that combat aircraft demanded far more than simple assembly line work. What Göring did not understand was that in Detroit, a Danish-born industrial leader, William Knudsen, was already dismantling that assumption. The former head of General Motors, now serving for $1 a year as Roosevelt's production chief, was guiding what would become one of the boldest industrial conversions ever attempted. And within 4 years, the United States would not merely approach Roosevelt's target, it would surpass it dramatically, producing close to 100,000 aircraft a year, while sustaining war efforts in 2 distant oceans at the same time. The statement that triggered German ridicule had been delivered earlier, on May 16, 1940, at the exact moment German armored formations were tearing through France. Speaking to Congress, Roosevelt laid down his demand with unmistakable clarity. He wanted the nation prepared to build at least 50,000 airplanes per year. Even friendly observers doubted it. In 1939, the United States had manufactured only 3,611 military aircraft. The Army Air Corps held around 1,700 combat planes, many already outdated. Yet Roosevelt was calling for production to multiply roughly 14 times, a leap that sounded unrealistic even by optimistic standards. That leap would soon have a name attached to it. William Knudsen became the central figure behind the effort. Asked who could possibly deliver something so extreme, presidential advisor Bernard Baruch gave a blunt answer. First Knudsen, second Knudsen, third Knudsen. Knudsen walked away from a $300,000 salary to serve the country that had taken him in, bringing the logic of automotive mass production into the world of aircraft manufacturing. The shift began at once. By December 1941, American industry was turning out roughly 2,000 military aircraft per month, about a 20-fold jump compared with 2 years earlier. Ford revealed plans for an enormous bomber facility at Willow Run, Michigan. Boeing expanded production capacity in Seattle. Douglas rapidly hired thousands. The arsenal of democracy was no longer an idea. It was becoming a machine. Inside the Nazi leadership, the refusal to take this seriously was rooted in more than miscalculation. It drew strength from racial ideology and deliberate self-deception. One man in Washington, however, had been reporting the truth. General Friedrich von Bettiker, Germany's military attaché in the United States from 1933 to 1941, sent detailed warnings about American mobilization. In a cable from December 1940, he cautioned that U.S. wartime output would rise to levels almost impossible to imagine. In Berlin, his message was brushed aside as defeatist exaggeration. When Bettiker met Hitler in February 1939 to discuss America's industrial potential, the Führer responded not with analysis, but with ideological fury, arguing about alleged American degeneracy instead of engaging with the intelligence. Hitler claimed Americans were incapable of enduring war, and that belief would later exact a brutal price. The bias reached every level of the system. Luftwaffe analysts interpreted reports of women joining aircraft production not as a sign of strength, but as proof the Americans were strained and failing. The idea that a democracy could mobilize more effectively than a totalitarian state simply did not fit their worldview. When news surfaced of factories operating on 3 shifts, German evaluators assumed the reports must be inflated. Nazi assumptions could not accommodate what was actually taking shape. Ford's Willow Run would become the most visible symbol of that American scale. Built on open farmland beginning April 18, 1941, it grew into the largest single-roof factory on Earth, about 3.5 million square feet, with a production line running roughly a mile. Ford production chief Charles Sorensen made an audacious promise: 1 B-24 Liberator bomber every hour, while other facilities struggled to finish even 1 per day. But the early reality was brutal. The first aircraft, completed in September 1942, had to be torn apart and rebuilt. Defects were rampant. Quality failures climbed to roughly 50%. By February 1943, Willow Run was producing only 56 bombers per month, far below the promised flood of hundreds. Critics turned Ford's bomber gamble into a punchline, calling it, "Will it run?" Yet inside Willow Run, engineers refused to quit. They began by dividing the B-24's 488,193 individual parts into smaller, controllable subassemblies. New methods followed: hydraulic riveting equipment, pre-made wiring harnesses, and truly moving production lines. Even as the aircraft's design kept shifting, 578 changes in 1943 alone, they kept the output climbing. By September 1943, the plant was reaching 148 bombers per month. Then the pace surged. By December, production hit 365 a month. The decisive turning point arrived in April 1944, when Willow Run delivered 428 B-24s, 1 aircraft every 63 minutes, running day and night without interruption. At that rate, a single American factory was producing more than the entire German aviation industry could match. German pilots began to sense this imbalance as early as the fighting in Tunisia. Major Johannes Steinhoff, leading JG-77, wrote in December 1942 that the Americans were no longer inexperienced flyers, and more troubling still, their numbers seemed to grow every day. Through 1943, that realization spread quickly. On January 27, the United States carried out its first raid on Germany itself. 64 bombers struck Wilhelmshaven. By October, on the day later known as Black Thursday at Schweinfurt, the Americans could lose 60 B-17s and replace those losses within 2 weeks. The arithmetic became impossible to ignore. During Big Week, February 20 to 25, 1944, the 8th and 15th Air Forces launched roughly 3,500 bomber sorties aimed at Germany's aircraft industry. The Luftwaffe lost somewhere between 262 and 355 fighters. But the deeper damage was elsewhere. Around 100 veteran pilots who could not be replaced. General Adolf Galland told Göring bluntly that Germany was losing 1,200 fighters per month, while producing only 1,000. America's balance sheet looked entirely different. The United States was turning out about 2,500 fighters monthly, while losing roughly 400. Major Heinz Baer, one of Germany's leading aces with 220 victories, later described a mission over Brunswick in January 1944. The bomber stream ran from horizon to horizon, at least 700 flying fortresses and liberators.
Against that, there were only 8 fighters, facing hundreds. By then, it was becoming clear that Germany was being overwhelmed not by a single weapon, but by a system. In 1944, American aircraft production reached astonishing scale. In that single year, U.S. factories built 96,270 aircraft, including 16,048 four-engine bombers, 35,743 fighters, and 22,591 multi-engine aircraft. That one-year total surpassed Germany's entire wartime production of roughly 94,677 planes. And the gap was not only numerical. Each American heavy bomber carried 13 0.50 caliber machine guns and massive stores of ammunition. German fighters, increasingly stretched, were often sent up with reduced ammo loads. American aircraft arrived with powered turrets, advanced bomb sights, and increasingly refined navigation systems. German pilots faced additional disadvantages. Many German fighters were operating without reliable radios. In the United States, output kept accelerating. Boeing's Seattle Plant 2 was assembling 16 B-17s per day by May 1944. Douglas aircraft, employing just 68 workers in 1936, had expanded into a workforce of 167,000 across 9 facilities. North American Aviation was producing roughly 500 P-51 Mustangs per month. Lockheed reached a tempo of 1 P-38 Lightning every 90 minutes, even while applying 2,127 combat-driven modifications. The supporting industries matched that speed. General Motors produced 57,658 aircraft engines under license. Packard built 55,523 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. Raw materials surged as well. Alcoa's aluminum production rose by 600%. Dow Chemical's magnesium output expanded from 6 million annually to 333 million. And perhaps most damaging to Nazi assumptions, the American workforce was transforming in ways Berlin had never imagined. Women, less than 1% of aircraft workers in 1941, made up 65% by 1943, around 310,000 women in the industry. At Douglas Long Beach, 22,381 of 41,621 employees were women. Rose Will Monroe, the real-life inspiration behind Rosie the Riveter, drove 3,000 rivets per shift at Willow Run with 99.5% accuracy. At Douglas, women inspectors helped cut defect rates from 3.2% to 0.3%. Ford even reshaped tools for smaller hands, changes that unexpectedly raised productivity. Lighter pneumatic equipment reduced exhaustion. Better positioned workstations lowered injury rates. German intelligence read the growing presence of women as a sign of American weakness. A captured Luftwaffe report dismissed them as temporary workers and predicted a collapse in quality. The opposite happened. Precision improved. Women proved especially strong in tasks requiring careful detail, wiring, instruments, inspection. Their integration was not evidence of desperation, but of national capacity. As U.S. output surged higher, German leadership retreated further into illusion. In February 1944, Göring approved the Jaeger program, an attempt to disperse production into 729 underground sites, powered largely by forced labor. The Mittelwerk complex alone held about 60,000 prisoners, with roughly 20,000 dying in brutal conditions. The underground plants produced defects as often as aircraft, while sabotage by enslaved workers became common. The scattered network created new bottlenecks.
Parts had to be transported between distant sites, slowing everything. Quality oversight broke down. The Mittelwerk system, taken as a whole, produced fewer engines per month than Ford's single plant in Chicago. And while Germany buried its industry underground, American innovation and efficiency continued to accelerate. Boeing pushed American mass production even further by introducing modular construction for the B-29 across 4 separate plants, built around the principle that parts would be fully interchangeable from one facility to another. The pressurized B-29, priced at $65,000 apiece, carried levels of technology that Germany could not equal even in prototype form. By early 1945, the United States was rolling out roughly 100 B-29s each month. And on June 6, 1944, the scale of what American industry had made possible was displayed to the world. The invasion force deployed 11,590 Allied aircraft against just 319 German sorties, a ratio of roughly 36 to 1. This was not merely a battlefield advantage. It was the visible result of industrial dominance so overwhelming it resembled destruction by production alone. From January through May 1944, the pre-invasion air campaign dropped 145,000 tons of bombs on German targets, more than Germany had managed to drop on Britain across the entire war. And when the airborne phase began, transport planes lifted 3 airborne divisions in a single day, using more aircraft than Germany's entire transport arm had ever possessed. By December 1944, individual operations were reaching staggering sizes. Raids involving around 1,200 bombers protected by 900 fighters. The P-51 Mustang had the range to strike as far as Poland, the performance to challenge any enemy aircraft, and, most critically, was available in numbers so great that losses did not alter the equation. German pilots, watching them appear everywhere at once, gave them a nickname, Indians, as if they were swarming across the sky in endless waves. And as defeat drew nearer, even figures at the top of the Nazi state began to admit what they could no longer deny. In December 1944, Goebbels wrote in his diary that Göring's repeated promises of Luftwaffe supremacy now looked like a kind of criminal self-deception. Germany, he said, was trying to fight the world's greatest industrial power with nothing but words. Rommel, speaking to his staff before D-Day, warned that the Americans could absorb losses at a ratio of 10 to 1 and still crush Germany through sheer material weight. When they came ashore, he predicted, they would arrive with such superiority in equipment that no defensive line could endure. Even Hitler, in January 1945, conceded to Speer that they should have taken Bettiker's reports seriously. America's industrial capacity, he admitted, had been decisive. After the war, Albert Speer testified that Allied bombing had cut German output by 35% for tanks, 31% for aircraft, and 42% for trucks. He argued without hesitation that the systematic American assault on industrial targets was what ultimately broke German armaments production. Germany's Me-262 jet fighter, operational in mid-1944, was real innovation, about 100 miles per hour faster than any Allied fighter in the air. Hitler and Göring placed enormous faith in this wonder weapon, convinced it could restore control of the skies even with Germany outnumbered. But the numbers never came. Germany built only about 1,430 Me-262s in total,
and at no point were more than roughly 200 operational at the same time. Engines required major maintenance after just 10 hours of use. Critical materials were in short supply, forcing compromises and substitute components that further weakened reliability. The United States, meanwhile, had started its own jet work in 1942. The Bell P-59 did not match German jets, but Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, described here as superior to any German jet, entered production before the war ended. The deeper point was structural. American industry had the capacity to pursue multiple advanced programs simultaneously, a freedom Germany did not have. The contrast captured the outcome of the production war in its most direct form. Germany's edge in jet technology could not compensate for America's ability to field thousands upon thousands of conventional fighters while still building the next generation. In total war, quality without sufficient quantity became meaningless. Göring's arrest on May 8, 1945, by troops of the U.S. 36th Infantry Division marked the moment he could no longer evade the realities he had mocked years earlier. At first, during interrogation in Augsburg, he remained defiant, insisting German technology had been better and that only mass numbers had decided the outcome. His transfer to Camp Ashcan in Luxembourg, a holding site for senior Nazi prisoners, brought longer, more focused questioning. In July 1945, Major Kenneth Heckler conducted extended interviews that recorded Göring's gradual shift. He conceded that he had always known American industrial power was significant, but, he admitted, the way it was carried out went beyond even his darkest expectations. He pointed to Willow Run as proof. One American plant, he said, produced more aircraft than the entire German bomber force at its peak, something he described as almost impossible to comprehend. He was especially struck by logistics, America's capacity to supply forces across two oceans while still sustaining domestic production. Germany, he admitted, struggled to support troops even 500 miles from home, while the United States supplied armies operating 5,000 miles from American shores. And at Nuremberg, prosecutors would confront him with a mountain of data showing, in detail, the industrial imbalance that had decided the war. By 1944, the evidence was being laid out in stark visual form. Charts showed that the United States was building more aircraft in a single month than Germany could produce in an entire year. In the courtroom, prosecutors screened footage of Willow Run's assembly lines while reading out the names of German cities struck by bombers that had rolled out of that one factory. Göring's testimony on March 14, 1946, exposed just how hard it was for him to mentally grasp the scale. He conceded that he had always considered America's economic and technical capacity unusually strong, especially in aviation. But, he insisted, he had never believed it was possible to multiply aircraft production 100-fold in 4 years. To him, that kind of growth had seemed physically unreal. Prison psychologist G. M. Gilbert recorded Göring's fixation on the numbers. Again and again, he returned to production statistics, recalculating ratios as if a different equation might change the outcome, measuring single American plants against the entire German system. He appeared especially haunted by Willow Run, repeatedly referring to it as the factory that had broken Germany's back. When he was shown that the United States had produced 812,615 aircraft engines compared to Germany's 241,675, he reportedly did not argue. He simply looked at the figures in silence. At that point, defeat was not a debate. It was mathematics. Even today, the scope of the transformation remains difficult to absorb. From just 3,611 military aircraft in 1940, American industry expanded until, by the end of the war, total production reached 295,959 aircraft, 97,810 bombers, 99,465 fighters, and 98,684 other types. This was not merely mass output. It reflected a broader system that outperformed its rival in organization, speed, and consistency. At peak, around 2 million Americans worked in aircraft manufacturing, and the workforce was unprecedented in its breadth. Women, African Americans, Mexican Americans, Native Americans, disabled workers, teenagers, and older citizens all became part of the industrial front line. It was a democratic mobilization that achieved what centralized coercion could not: voluntary coordination that surpassed forced labor by every meaningful measure. The men and women who entered factories in 1941 with no aviation experience emerged in 1945 as the most capable aircraft workforce on Earth. And they did more than assemble airplanes. They reshaped manufacturing itself. Statistical quality control methods refined for bomber production spread into standard industrial use across the world. Automation techniques developed for plants like Willow Run would influence global factory design for decades. The engineers who learned to build bombers through complex assembly systems would later help build entirely new categories of machines, including the production infrastructure that made the Saturn V possible. And the women who riveted B-24s would raise the generation that eventually walked on the moon. The production miracle did not end with victory. It helped define the era that followed. The financial scale also seemed to contradict traditional economic expectations. Aircraft production absorbed about $45 billion in $1940, described here as roughly $800 billion in today's terms. The B-29 program alone, the text notes, cost more than the Manhattan Project. Yet instead of collapsing the economy, war production produced an explosion of prosperity. Depression-era unemployment disappeared. Personal income roughly doubled between 1940 and 1945. Much of the expansion was financed through war bonds, purchased by the workers themselves. At Willow Run alone, employees bought about $45 million in bonds, helping fund the very factory in which they worked. Germany's picture was the reverse. By 1944, it devoted roughly 40% of its entire industrial capacity to aircraft production, yet still produced less than half of America's output. And as forced labor became more central, it proved disastrous. Sabotage spread, quality deteriorated, and the system increasingly undermined itself. The text highlights a striking contrast in productivity. After 1943, output per German worker reportedly declined, while American productivity increased by about 300%. And the industrial base built for war did not vanish afterward. It became the platform for peacetime dominance. Aluminum plants built for bombers shifted to materials for housing. Chemical facilities that supplied aviation fuels fed the plastics boom. Machine tool factories that equipped aircraft production lines helped retool American industry for global leadership. Behind raw volume stood a level of organizational control that Germany could not replicate. The War Production Board coordinated roughly 184,000 companies into a single integrated effort. IBM punch card systems tracked millions of parts moving through vast supply networks. At MIT, the radiation laboratory, employing about 4,000 scientists, created navigation technologies that gave American bombers true all-weather capability. And when combat revealed a weakness, the system responded with extraordinary speed. When the B-17 proved vulnerable to frontal attacks, Boeing added chin turrets in roughly 60 days. When the Pacific demanded longer range, Consolidated altered B-24 configurations without shutting down output. German modifications, by contrast, often took months or stretched into years. In the end, adaptability became as decisive as production totals. American aircraft changed continuously, shaped by global battlefield feedback. Lessons from the Pacific could reach factories serving the Atlantic within days. German aircraft, often built in isolated underground sites by enslaved workers, tended to remain static, while American designs evolved week by week. The feedback loop between frontline experience and industrial response created an efficiency that had no precedent. Pilots' observations moved rapidly to engineers, and engineering solutions returned to the sky almost immediately. Engineering fixes moved from problem reports to factory floors in a matter of days. Suggestions from the line didn't vanish into bureaucracy. They could reach the designers directly. This open, democratic circulation of information outperformed the rigid top-down control of the German system. And on October 15, 1946, only hours before he was scheduled to die, Hermann Göring wrote his final letter. In that letter, he offered his clearest acknowledgement of what the production war had meant. America, he argued, had not prevailed through superior battlefield skill, but through sheer industrial power. Germany, in his view, was not beaten by better soldiers, it was beaten by better factories. The country the Reich had scorned as a maker of consumer goods, he wrote, ultimately smothered the Wehrmacht under a flood of aluminum and steel. His last recorded words to Gilbert carried the same meaning. They had declared war on an industrial giant while it slept, he said, and once it awakened, Germany's fate was sealed. The Americans did not merely produce more, they transformed the entire act of producing. In his telling, every component of their system proved stronger than Germany's. Göring took his own life that night, but the final admissions remained. An epitaph for the man who had mocked American capacity and died understanding that a single American factory could outstrip the lifetime output of his Air Force. Many military historians view America's industrial achievement as the decisive engine of Allied victory. Without that overwhelming material advantage, the argument goes, D-Day could not have been mounted, the strategic air campaign could not have been sustained, and the war in the Pacific could not have been won. Air war historian Richard Overy summarized the logic in a single judgment. The outcome was decided less by tactical brilliance or fighting spirit than by the crushing weight of material. The Allies did not simply defeat their enemies, they buried them beneath production. The statistics reinforce that conclusion. By 1944, the United States alone was building more military aircraft than the rest of the world combined, Axis and Allied together. This was not a narrow margin. It was dominance by an entire order of magnitude. Germany was not facing a normal military setback. It was facing annihilation by industrial capacity. Yet the meaning of the production miracle extended beyond victory itself. In the text's framing, it demonstrated democracy's advantage over dictatorship, freedom's strength over tyranny, voluntary cooperation over coerced obedience. The workforce that made it possible was not composed of slaves or conscripts, but citizens who chose to mobilize. Göring's contempt for American industry stands as one of history's most consequential miscalculations. That dismissal, the narrative argues, helped cost Germany the war and contributed to the catastrophic human toll that followed. His failure to recognize what America could become meant the Third Reich was, in a sense, doomed before the first American bomber ever reached German skies. The leap from a few thousand aircraft to tens of thousands per year showed that free societies, when confronted by existential danger, could achieve what seemed impossible. American workers did not only reach Roosevelt's target, they surpassed it. They did not merely match German production, they exceeded it many times over, while also sustaining the war in the Pacific. The text turns that lesson outward, warning that leaders who confuse peacefulness with weakness or prosperity with softness risk repeating Göring's mistake. In 1940, America looked unprepared. By 1944, it had become a colossal industrial force that could not be stopped. The arsenal of democracy proved that production lines could be as decisive as front lines, that factory labor could carry strategic weight equal to soldiers, and that industrial mobilization could shape victory as surely as any battle plan. Göring learned that truth too late, at the price of his nation's ruin. From his scornful reaction to Roosevelt's announcement in May 1940 to his end in October 1946, his personal arc mirrored the wider collapse of Nazi Germany. His contempt became, in the text's terms, a symbol of the regime itself, a system that confused ideology with capability, mistook coercion for strength, and imagined racial mythology could overcome industrial mathematics. The Reich Marshal, who laughed at American aircraft production, died knowing that in 1944 alone, American factories produced more planes than Germany managed across the entire war. His mockery, the narrative concludes, became history's most expensive joke, paid for in total defeat. The headline totals underline the scale. The United States produced 295,959 military aircraft. Germany produced 94,677. But the deeper point, as the passage insists, was not only the raw numbers, it was the method. It was proof that free workers could outproduce slaves, that democratic coordination could outperform totalitarian command, and that a diverse nation could unite around a shared purpose and accomplish what looked unattainable. The B-24s leaving Willow Run every 63 minutes were not presented merely as machines of war, but as symbols, democracy's industrial reply to tyranny. Each rivet driven by a woman who had been a housewife months before. Each engine assembled by a teenager who had left school to contribute. Each wing fitted by workers who had survived poverty and discrimination. Together, they demonstrated, in the text's words, that free people, united by a common cause, could overwhelm oppression with production. Göring once laughed at the idea of America producing 50,000 planes a year. America answered by producing roughly twice that, reshaping the course of the war and the modern world. His laughter, as the passage frames it, became the sound of catastrophic misjudgment, the fatal underestimation of democracy's arsenal by a man who understood neither democracy nor manufacturing. In the end, the same force he dismissed, American production, buried him and everything he stood for beneath nearly 300,000 aircraft, turning contempt into the most complete kind of defeat.